Think about a child sitting at a dinner table. The food is warm, the house is full. There is laughter somewhere down the hallway. By every visible measure, everything is fine. But this child is watching, carefully, learning the shape of every room, reading the mood of every adult, making themselves as agreeable, as quiet, as useful as they possibly can. Because somewhere along the way, without anyone saying it directly, this child understood something. Being good was not enough. Being present was not enough. Being themselves was somehow never quite enough. And so they adapted. They folded their real self into something smaller, something more acceptable, something that wouldn't require too much. And they carried that folded-up version of themselves through childhood, through adolescence, through their adult relationships, quietly wondering why intimacy felt foreign, why being truly known by another person felt almost dangerous, why even in their closest relationships they still felt, in some place they couldn't name, completely alone. Maybe you recognize that child. Maybe, in some quiet part of you, you still are that child. If that landed somewhere real for you, you are not alone, and you are not broken. What you are is someone who grew up in an environment where your authentic self was not fully met. Not because you were too much, not because there was something fundamentally wrong with you, but because the people who were supposed to see you simply didn't have the capacity to. That distinction matters more than anything else we will talk about today. You were not invisible because you were unworthy of being seen. You were invisible because the eyes looking at you could only see so far. Psychologists have a name for what happens to a child in that environment. Donald Winnicott, one of the most influential child psychologists of the 20th century, called it the development of the false self. Here is what that means in plain language. When a child's authentic emotional needs are consistently unmet, when their sadness is dismissed, their excitement ignored, their real questions deflected, something remarkable happens in the young nervous system. The child does not conclude that the parent is wrong. The child concludes that they are, that their real feelings are the problem, that their genuine self is inconvenient, excessive, or somehow flawed. And so they build an alternative self, a performed self, a self that is more compliant, more palatable, more manageable to be around. Winnicott called this the false self, not a lie exactly, but an adaptation, a psychological armor the child constructs to survive an emotional environment that was never quite safe enough to be real in. The terrible efficiency of this mechanism is that it works. The performed self earns more approval, creates less friction, draws fewer punishing silences or subtle withdrawals. And so the child learns, the real me costs too much. The edited me is what gets love. And that lesson, absorbed before the child has the language to question it, becomes the operating system of their entire emotional life. Not for a year, not for a decade, for a lifetime, unless something changes. Let me tell you about a man named Daniel. Daniel was the kind of child everyone described as easy, calm, no trouble at all. His teachers called him mature, his relatives called him old for his age, and in a way they were right. He had aged far faster than he should have, because he had learned very early that the adults around him were not available for the full weight of his emotional world. His mother was physically present, in the kitchen, at the school gates, at every recital. But her presence was conditional on a version of Daniel she could manage. When he was happy, she was warm. When he was anxious or sad or struggling, something in her withdrew. Not cruelly, not deliberately, simply because she had never been taught how to hold another person's difficult feelings without making them her own. His father offered something different. He offered praise, but only for performance, for grades, for behavior, for the appearance of doing well. What Daniel felt about the grade, what the pressure of it cost him inside, that was never part of the conversation, because that conversation had never been modeled. And so Daniel learned. He learned to lead with his achievements and bury his anxiety. He learned to present the version of himself that generated warmth and withdraw the version that generated silence. He learned slowly and without knowing it to be a guest in his own emotional life. By the time he was an adult, Daniel could walk into any room and make people feel comfortable. He was perceptive, warm, impossibly good at reading what others needed. And yet, in his own relationships, he felt something he could never quite articulate. A glass wall, a sense that no matter how close someone got, they were getting close to the presentation, not to him. Daniel is not one man. He is millions of people, men and women who grew up in homes that looked fine from the outside, that provided every material thing, but left something essential unnamed and unmet. Neuroscience has begun to map what this absence does to the developing brain. Research by Dr. Martin Teicher at Harvard Medical School found that emotional neglect, not physical abuse, but the absence of adequate emotional attunement, produces measurable changes in the developing brain's architecture. The regions responsible for emotional regulation, social bonding, and self-perception show altered development when a child grows up without consistent emotional mirroring. What that means, translated from the laboratory into felt experience, is this. When no one reflects back to you that your inner world is real, valid, and worth attending to, your brain does not develop the full internal circuitry for doing that for yourself. You grow up emotionally fluent in the needs of others, emotionally illiterate in your own. You become, in a very real neurological sense, a stranger to yourself. But here's the part that most people who grew up this way never fully understand. And it's the part that changes everything once you see it. The qualities you developed in that environment, the attunement to others, the emotional intelligence, the almost supernatural ability to read a room, those did not come from nowhere. And they did not come without a cost that you have never been fully told about. Hold that thought, because where this leads is not where you might expect. Here's the thing about growing up unseen. You become extraordinarily good at seeing, because the child who cannot rely on a parent's emotional attunement must develop their own attunement to the parent. They become exquisitely sensitive to mood, to tension, to the micro-signals of withdrawal or displeasure. They learn to anticipate, to adjust, to manage the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else has noticed it has changed. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. The nervous system, calibrated to an unpredictable or emotionally inconsistent environment, learns to operate in a permanent state of low-grade alert. Not fear, exactly. More like readiness. More like the feeling of never quite being able to put the antenna down. And as these children grow into adults, that hypervigilance does not simply disappear. It migrates. It moves from the family home into every relationship, every workplace, every friendship. It becomes the person who always knows when something is wrong before anyone says it. The one everyone turns to, the one who holds the room together. On the surface, this looks like strength, and in some real way it is. But beneath it, if you look closely enough, is an exhaustion that never fully lifts. Because hypervigilance is expensive. The nervous system was not designed to be permanently scanning, and the person who grew up doing it often doesn't even know they're doing it anymore, because it became so integrated into who they are that they cannot see where they end and the watchfulness begins. Now here's where it gets even more complex, and it's the part most people miss. The same child who became invisible to their parents often becomes invisible to themselves, because the practice of suppressing your authentic reactions, of monitoring and adjusting and editing in real time, becomes automatic. You no longer choose to hide what you feel. You simply stop noticing what you feel until it is already buried. The feelings that were too much, too inconvenient, too unlikely to be received. They do not disappear. They go underground. They show up later as a chronic, low-level sadness you can't source, as a perfectionism that can never quite be satisfied, as a difficulty receiving love that doesn't have to be earned. You find it easier to give than to receive. You find it easier to help than to ask. You find it easier to understand others than to understand yourself. And you do not always know why. Maybe you've noticed something like this in yourself. The strange discomfort of being deeply cared for. The mild panic that can arrive unexpectedly when someone truly wants to know how you are, not how you seem, not how you're managing, but how you actually are. The part of you that wants to deflect, to minimize, to give them a shorter, tidier, more manageable version of the truth. That is not a personality quirk. That is a nervous system following its original programming. The program that says, your real self is too much. Give them the edited version. That's what gets. Think about that for a moment, because that program was written for you by circumstances before you were old enough to decide whether you agreed with it. And most people spend their entire adult lives running it, without ever knowing it's running. The question then is not, what is wrong with me? The question is, who was I before I learned that I had to disappear to be loved? This is not a therapeutic exercise. It is not a quick reframe. It is, genuinely, one of the most quietly radical questions a person can sit with, because the answer does not come all at once. It comes in small recognitions scattered across years. A moment in therapy when you say something true and realize you have never said it out loud before. A conversation where you don't immediately minimize what you're feeling and something in you notices. That was different. A relationship in which, slowly, carefully, you allow someone to see a part of you that you have kept folded away. And they don't withdraw, and the old program flickers just slightly. That's not weakness. That's not arrogance. That's not neediness. That is the self beginning to surface. Kristin Neff, whose research on self-compassion at the University of Texas has changed how psychologists understand healing, found something that feels obvious once you hear it. The people who struggle most to offer themselves compassion are almost always the people who were never offered it by others first. Self-compassion has to be learned. It is not innate. It has to be modeled, received, internalized. And when that modeling was absent, the path back to it is rarely fast. But here's what neuroscience and decades of clinical work confirm. The path back exists. Neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to form new connections, To literally rewire itself through new experience means that what was learned in childhood, under conditions you did not choose, is not the final word. The nervous system that learned to disappear can slowly and with genuine effort learn something else. Learn that presence is safe. Learn that need does not drive love away. Learn over time to be a witness to itself. Not all at once, not without cost, not in a single conversation or a single video or a single moment of clarity, but gradually, in small increments, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments in which you chose just this once to be a little more honest, a little more present, a little less edited. If you've stayed with me this far, if something in what I've described felt like it was written about you, I want you to hear this clearly. The invisibility you experienced as a child was never the truth of you. It was the limit of the people around you. You were not too much. You were not too sensitive. You were not the problem. You were simply a real person in a space that didn't know how to hold real people. The false self you built was not a betrayal of who you are. It was the most intelligent thing a child in your circumstances could have done. It was survival. It was adaptation. It was love. Love for the people around you that ran so deep you made yourself smaller so they could be comfortable. You don't need to condemn that. You don't need to be angry at the child who did it. That child was doing their best with what they had. You are allowed to grieve what was missing, not with bitterness, but with the quiet, honest acknowledgement that something essential was absent, and that absence shaped you in ways you are still discovering. And you are allowed, slowly, gently, without a deadline, to begin finding your way back to the self you put away. Because that self is still there. It was always there, waiting with extraordinary patience for someone to finally look. And maybe, for the first time, that someone can be you.